Let's talk about podcasting, and this is a very interesting one, unlike no other that we're going to be talking about in this course, because when people are ready to listen to a podcast, that means they are in no position to do anything else. They're in no position to watch something, a video or a bunch of pictures or animated GIFs. No, they're usually driving or chilling at home or at work working, but still wanting to consume something just with their ears. And so essentially you cater into a secondary activity, but when people are really really thirsty for it. So there's something about this media that basically has it cornered just specifically for audio. And remember Howard Stern? I mean, he's still around now, but he became hugely popular in a time when YouTube was really growing and coming of age, and television was expanding into cable networks, and there were new channels popping up, and everybody thought, oh my God, radio is going to be dead. Who wants to listen to stuff when we can see? Well, guess what? I believe until till this day, he is the highest paid entertainer of all time. And there were quite a few other morning shows that became popular as well, even after he left the regular radio and went to Sirius Radio. And there were satellite radio that kind of was born out of this. People wanted to listen and be entertained while they were stuck in traffic going to and from work. Now there are other activities. A lot of people have jobs where they're behind the desk doing very tedious work. So their brain's not that busy. As a matter of fact, they're thirsty for some entertainment. That's when they can listen to a podcast. And a lot of people realize they don't necessarily want to listen to music while they're driving. They want to be entertained with interviews and jokes and comedy, politics, news, and so forth. And that's why podcasting became very popular. So if you're a podcaster, you got the audience that is absolutely in no way able to consume other media. So that's the greatest thing about podcasting. But at the same time, you don't need to have as much equipment, right? Equipment is one, costs money, and especially when you're starting out or even growing, it can really add up. And on top of that, you have to learn all this equipment, make sure it works. The more equipment, the more complicated it is, the more possibility of making a mistake. There's also software that comes with it, and that's a whole different story. Also needs to be in full harmony with your hardware. It gets complicated. Well, when you just have to deal with audio, it can be very simple. And just like with video, we can record audio with our phones. So you already have a phone. You don't even have to invest in a microphone. And yes, professional podcasters have really nice microphones, but even with that, a very nice microphone costs way less than a very nice camera. And the software is also much less expensive. You only have to work with audio. So that is another perk that makes the entire thing cost less money, and you can start out with a much smaller learning curve, which is huge. A lot of people never start, as I mentioned many times before, because of they believe it's a huge mountain to climb. But with podcasting, that is not as scary. Now, the biggest, I would say the biggest issue with podcasting is the fact that discovery is probably one of the weakest. Even when we talk about having your own website, you still, if you do SEO, you can count on Google and other search engines and so forth. Of course, if you're on Instagram and YouTube, there are search engines and discovery basically built in. With podcasting, it's not. First of all, you have to upload to different platforms, and most of the podcasters get more than half of their listeners from Apple. So that has its own discovery, and it is growing. I know podcasting's been around for a while, but it's still coming of age even now. So Apple just changed a lot of its UI around, and now there are different discovery options that you didn't have before, but they're still not fully developed. And then there are others like Spotify and TuneIn Radio and so many other 5 or 6 at the very least major platforms where you need to upload your podcast, but they don't give you as good of a discovery as, say, Google and YouTube and Instagram and so forth. So a lot of podcasters really rely on their other social media to draw their listeners in, which a lot of times makes them questions like, well, I already got the following in Instagram. Why don't they just produce Instagram content instead of now having them to forward everybody to podcasting? Because a lot of people don't like crossing social media platforms, right? You might have a following on Instagram and then have something going on with your podcast or Facebook and YouTube, and your followers go, we want to stay here. This is why we followed you here on Instagram. So discovery is a little difficult, and of course, even getting your podcast in Google, essentially, you have to now pretty much do the same thing that you would do if you would have your own website. Now, I do have to say that Google is now becoming more and more advanced as they're indexing podcasts, because they're recognizing all the wording, all of the phrasing in your podcast, creating transcripts. And when somebody is looking for something, they will search through the transcripts of your podcast. And so it's becoming more advanced. But again, it's still kind of early stages. So discovery is not there yet. It is evolving. The algorithm is evolving. So you're gonna have to really cater to that. Right now, most podcasters rely on being on other podcasts or getting people come to their podcast from social media. So and a lot of another thing that you probably noticed, that a lot of podcasters are former celebrities or current celebrities, but they were celebrities before, and then they decided to have a podcast, like Joe Rogan and Adam Carolla and many others. They didn't start from scratch. So starting from scratch is a little bit challenging. But again, don't forget, I said much easier than starting a YouTube channel or even Instagram following. All right, let's move to the next one, and it kind of goes hand in hand. This is another challenge you're going to have to figure out. There are no fully centralized statistics. And statistics, as you know, is very important, not only for yourself to grow your following, because you always want to know what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong, and you can only do that and really get to know your audience, where they're coming from, what their age is and sex and so forth. You can only do that by looking at the stats. And once again, Apple has its own stats, and Spotify's got its own stats, but none of it is in sync. And everything is still evolving, everything is still growing. But again, if you're trying to attract sponsors will always want to know, what are your stats? The one solid stat you can pretty much count on across all of those platforms is how many downloads your podcast had. And even though a download is a pretty solid stat in terms of, when somebody downloads a podcast, a lot of times they end up listening to it. But for how long, and have they, and where are they located? All of that stuff is just not available yet. I'm sure it will be in the future. So it's much harder to get the statistics that you will need to attract and to really come up with your own rate for sponsors. Now, in many cases, and it depends on what quality of the audio you want to upload and how often you want to upload it. It costs money. And a lot of times it can get up there. If you're having a podcast that you want to create maybe a daily or a couple times a week, it may end up and just be too expensive to host. And it's something that you have to think about it. It is an investment pretty much right away. Where if you're uploading on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and so forth, hosting is pretty much $0. So that's something to consider as well. Let's talk about brand recognition, because if you are in your pictures, or whether on Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, or of course if you're in front of your audience on YouTube, you have your own brand, which is your face, your voice, your logo, and so many other things. A lot of times even the way you dress. But with podcast, all you have is your voice, and that is the toughest brand to create, because voices are a little bit harder to distinguish than faces. Definitely, you cannot put your own logo as much on your podcast. As a matter of fact, you can only do it in the art, in the art that goes on your podcast and on your overall channel. So it is much harder to, and if a lot of times brand recognition is everything. So there's a challenge there. It doesn't mean you can't overcome it, especially if you have a unique voice or maybe an accent like I do. But nevertheless, it's just yet another challenge to deal with. Of course, you are limited to topics, because some topics are just very visual. If we're talking about fashion or even cars, I talk about cars on my show, on my main YouTube channel, and a lot of times audience wants to see the car, the how fast it's driving, the user interface. And if we're talking about some issues with door handles, for example, this is a very, very visual topic. You're going to be very limited, and you may not be able to cover those topics, and that means that this may just not be the right medium for you at all. And the reason I mention that is also it's hard to you will also be limited to brands and products that you will be able to advertise, because once again, if you want to advertise a makeup kit, this is something that's very visual that you won't be able to do a good job. And a lot of brands that have products that are best sold by visually showcasing them, a lot of brands just don't want to advertise on a podcast. Now, one thing that I also wanted to mention is, as I mentioned this before, YouTube and Instagram are the platforms where those advertisers, those sponsors that are willing to try or already been sold on advertising with social media influencers, they're not as ready with podcasts. That is a lot of times a tough sell. At the same time, you can mention to them that, hey, if we're going to be selling something on my podcast, I will be the person selling it. So we won't need to run a commercial. I will be the one talking about the product. And every time the host, the influencer, talks about the product, obviously it is much easier to sell. I do it on my YouTube channel because I know that if I just jam a commercial in there, and even if we're talking about pre-rolls, people know it's a commercial, but when their favorite influencer, their trusted source, is actually saying, hey, listen, this is something I'm using. I am telling you in my voice with my face in front of you, you should buy this, you should own it. That is a whole different story. So that's a bit of an advantage, because in podcasting, you're usually the one who is presenting the brand to your audience, and there's a big value in that as well. So as I mentioned, there are pros, there are cons. It is a very unique media, maybe not as ready for monetization as other, but again, as I mentioned before, right? When something's just developing, when something is brand new, especially as we're talking about statistics and search engines, this could be a good opportunity for you to get into it. I do want to mention that sometimes YouTubers, like the way YouTubers that maybe are not as visual, this could be a news segment or storytelling vlog, where people have their main social media platform choice as YouTube, but then they strip the audio and they put it as a podcast. And that does work many times, as long as you take care of the quality of your audio. And the other way around, podcasters a lot of times will just put a camera on themselves. And I know that's a little bit more work, and then put it on YouTube. And that way they kind of have the best of both worlds. So, this is one of those things that can go hand in hand with another media for you. So obviously, make your choice wisely. But podcasting is definitely something to consider.